extremely grateful to have Christina. Cory Leonard at the Kennedy Center has said how difficult it is to get her here. She's in Belgium, so she's come all the way from Europe to speak with us tonight. And she's doing other things as well here in Utah, but we're so grateful to have her here. She grew up in Virginia, in Reston, and in Arlington, part of the Mount Vernon stake. She is a BYU alum. She studied international relations here and got a BA, and then went to GW in Washington, D.C. and got her master's in international affairs, another MA at the National Defense University in D.C. And after graduation from that, she became a minister counselor for public affairs at the UN mission to the European Union. She came to Brussels, and that's her position in Brussels. She came to Brussels from Islamabad, Pakistan, where she served in the same capacity. During her foreign service career, she has served in the U.S. embassies and consulates in Istanbul, Turkey, Budapest, Hungary, Guangzhou, China, and as an intern in Vientiane, Laos. In Washington, D.C., Tomlinson served with the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, with a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in several capacities in the Executive Secretariat, including as part of the traveling staff for Secretary Colin Powell and Secretary Condoleezza Rice. Wow. Before joining the State Department, she was a Presidential Management Fellow at the U.S. Department of Commerce, an Administrative Officer at the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. We're so grateful to have Christina here. Please welcome Christina Tomlinson.
So I'm very grateful to be here. I'd like to thank both Matthew Clark and Quinn Monson and Cory Leonard in absentia. But really, I'd like to thank you for being here. This is your hour. We're going to talk about careers in the Foreign Service. I'm going to say a few things, but I really want to hear what your questions and concerns might be. I'll tell you a little bit about what it's like to do what I do. But it's really, I'm having deja vu being here. That portrait of David Kennedy has been here since I was here, and I graduated in 1990. So he's been watching over many generations of students for many years. So a little interactive. Okay, so the Department of State was, does anybody know which order it was created in terms of the cabinet departments? Anybody know? Okay, it was first. It was the first cabinet department created by James Madison. And does anybody know who the first Secretary of State was? Who just said Jefferson? All right, yes, Thomas Jefferson, also our third president, was the first Secretary of State of the United States, and we've had many since then, and I honestly don't know the number, but of course the current incumbent is Rex Tillerson. We have over 300 embassies, consulates, and missions throughout the world, and representing the American people in over 190 countries. There are, of course, some countries we don't have representation in, places like Libya, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, Iran, Bhutan, just in case you were thinking about going there. And there are about 75,000 people who work for the State Department. Of those 75,000, 8,000 are Foreign Service officers like me. And the rest of them, most of actually our employees are foreign nationals who work in our embassies and consulates overseas. So about 2/3 of the people who work for the State Department are actually citizens of another country. But they staff our embassies and consulates and provide great substantive expertise and continuity. There's no typical career path to join the Foreign Service. Now, I majored in international relations right here at BYU, went on to get a graduate degree in the same subject. And yes, that's a very logical career path for going into the Foreign Service. But we are what's known as generalists. And being a generalist means that you can specialize in just about anything, and you can come into the Foreign Service with just about anything. So I came into the Foreign Service in a class of people. The man who sat next to me in my first class was a former French citizen who had been in the corporate world all of his life. He had lived in the United States for a long time as a permanent resident, and he became a U.S. citizen because he wanted to be a diplomat. And it was an opportunity that he would never have had in France. And so he came to us with an extremely unique background. I've known people in the Foreign Service who came into the State Department with degrees in astronomy and nuclear physics. And we need people who have degrees in science, because part of what we do is to advance U.S. interests in those fields throughout the world. But knowing something about international affairs certainly doesn't hurt. How many of you are familiar with the careers.state.gov website? Yes, and soon all of you will be. So I highly recommend that if you are thinking about a career in the State Department, that you spend a little time on that website. It walks you through the various options, and not just Foreign Service options in the State Department. If, say, living overseas is not your thing, we also have about, let's see if my math is right, about 10,000 jobs in what we call the civil service. And those are people who work primarily in domestic assignments and mostly in Washington, provide the administrative and substantive continuity of the department. And we also have different tracks of the Foreign Service, or what we call cones. So I came into the Foreign Service as an officer specializing in the economic field. I did that for 10 years and decided I'd rather be doing public diplomacy, which is frankly more fun. Nothing against economists. My mother is one, but you know, frankly, I think public affairs is more fun. But we also have political officers who, of course, cover the political developments of particular countries and how those affect U.S. interests. As I mentioned, economic officers who follow the micro and macro economics of other countries and to try to advance U.S. economic interests, like in trade and manufacturing and in innovation and entrepreneurship and things like that. Management officers for the most part run the embassies. They make sure that the lights are on. They make sure that we are able to negotiate new land for embassies when we need it, or to get tax exemptions when we need it. Consular officers are the folks out there who are most closely day-to-day defending American citizens' interests, because they're the ones, when you travel and you lose your passport, who will help you. But they also adjudicate visa decisions. So based on U.S. immigration and naturalization law, they have the right to decide whether someone standing in front of them who presents an application for a visa is qualified to receive one. And I did that for my first couple of years in the department in China. And we would stand at a window for, 6 to 8 hours a day. And I actually interviewed people who were immigrating to the United States. And most of them were coming through the family reunification. You've heard a lot about that in the news right now. But many of them were coming because of their skills and abilities. We had Olympic gold medalists and artists and gourmet chefs and all of these kinds of things, people who would be bringing their skills and expertise to the United States. So how did I get there? What's that?
Oh, the last thing you were talking about was
Consular officers, yeah. No, how did I get here, I guess is really the question. But thank you. So as I said, I graduated from BYU in 1990. And I will give BYU, I grew up in Virginia, although I was born here in Provo. BYU was not the place I had actually planned to go to school. And kind of at the last minute, I had a realization that I needed a change of environment from where I had been, and I needed a change of scene. And so I came to BYU. And I always said, if I don't like it, I can always go back to Virginia. And of course, I loved it, stayed here for 4.5 years. And I'm glad I did. But one of the reasons I'm really glad I did is because some of the opportunities that I was able to take advantage of here. I participated in Washington Seminar. I did an internship with then Senator Chuck Robb from Virginia. He was an interesting guy. He'd been a Marine in Vietnam. He was married to the daughter of Lyndon B. Johnson. And he, since leaving the Senate, has also headed up the 9/11 Commission on where the intelligence went wrong in 9/11. But the other thing I got to do while I was here was study abroad. And my study abroad director's picture is on that wall back there, Dr. Stan Taylor. Many of you may know him. And I went to London for 6 months with Dr. Taylor in the fall of 1987. Now, London is not that exotic in today's terms, and I know there are a lot of other opportunities, but I can tell you being in Europe and being in that part of the world in 1987 was really formative for me. While we were there, we got to spend a week at the Jerusalem Center, and that was about 2 months before the Palestinian Intifada started in 1987, so the second Palestinian uprising started just after we were there. So we were able to be there right before that happened. We also spent a week in Russia, or at that time, the Soviet Union, and were able to experience what it was like to live in the Soviet Union during the period of glasnost and perestroika. And those experiences helped open my mind, helped me see that there was something beyond our borders. And it's been a little time overseas as a kid, but nothing like the intellectual and cultural experience I was able to have through study abroad. And so I encourage you, particularly with all of the various opportunities that now exist, to take advantage of that. After Washington Seminar, I graduated and I went on a mission. I served in California, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I came back from my mission and worked for the UN office in Washington as an administrative job, but it was a great exposure to the work of the United Nations and what they do. After a couple of years of doing that, I was kind of ready to leave and decided to go back to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school, it's when I did an internship with the State Department. It was also when I took the Foreign Service exam for the first time and did not pass, by the way. One piece of advice I would give you, if you really want to do this job, just keep taking the exam until you pass, because you will eventually. I worked for the Department of Commerce for a year and then started working for the Department of State. And as Matthew mentioned, I've been in China, Hungary, Turkey, Pakistan, now Belgium, and also Washington several times. Why did I choose a career in government and foreign service? Public service is important. Public service is really important. It is important to serve your country, and it is an honor to do so. I knew that a military career was not what I was cut out for, and my mother had served for the Department of Interior for 30 years, and I had seen what an honorable experience that was. And so I was intrigued by working for the government. Didn't know that it would be in the Foreign Service per se, but felt that a career in government was an honorable and interesting thing to do. My mission president gave me the advice to find something you love to do and then get someone to pay you to do it, which is very good advice, by the way. And when I was an intern in Laos, I worked for an ambassador who had been one of the hostages in Iran in 1979. And after, as you know, the Iranian revolutionary regime, after taking over the U.S. Embassy, kept a handful of our diplomats hostage for 444 days between 1979 and 1981. And Ambassador Thomas had been one of them as a young officer in the political section. And he did not leave the State Department after that experience. I'm not sure, reflecting on it, whether I would have been strong enough to stay. But seeing his example, knowing what he went through, I thought to myself, there is something to this. There's really something to this Foreign Service career, that someone would go through such a horrible experience and yet want to stay because they felt it was so important to do so. And that stayed with me and has stayed with me to this day. I will tell you that volunteer experiences and internships are absolutely critical to finding both out what you want to do, frankly, because I tried the Hill and I decided maybe that was not what I wanted to do. I tried the private sector, and it was interesting, but also not necessarily what I wanted to do. And then I finally settled on the State Department. And I was very happy to get a State Department internship. We actually have someone from BYU, Idaho right now at the embassy I work with, which is terrific, and I am really glad that he is there. I will tell you that I think that my ability to get in the Foreign Service is a little bit of luck, a little bit of providence, and a little bit of hard work. And I think you need, all three of those things as you chart your course. I studied French here at BYU, and I was really hoping to go on a mission to a Francophone country. And I also, of course, graduated from BYU a year after the Berlin Wall came down, and they were opening a lot of new missions, all over Eastern Europe and in Russia and in fantastic places. And so when I got my call to Fresno, California, I was a little bit surprised, shall we say. But I, sort of pulled up my gumption and went on my mission and ended up working on my mission with refugees from Laos. And for those of you who know, Laos experienced, after the Vietnam War, Laos experienced a major civil war, which caused the flight of thousands of people, many of whom went to the United States. And so I was able to work with that community for the 18 months that I spent in California. Fast forward 5 years later, when I was trying to get an internship with the State Department, that was 1995, and we had the first government shutdown under the administration of President Clinton. And my application for an internship got lost because, that's when the government is shut down. No one's answering the phones or the fax machine. And at that point, email was still relatively new. So after several months of waiting and hearing nothing, I finally was able to work my network and find somebody in the State Department who would take my call and who said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We pretty much have filled all of our slots." And I'm sure I was deeply disappointed at that time, but I sort of pulled myself together and I said, "I'll go anywhere. I speak Lao." And there was this silence on the other end of the line when the woman said, "That's the one country we haven't filled yet." So off I went to Laos for the summer. And I use that story not only because I believe in the providence angle of it, but I tell that story to people because I believe in the power of volunteer experiences and the skills that you get from them and what they do to you in terms of your character and your ability to have a devotion to service. And I have one of the things that we talk about a lot in public diplomacy for the United States is one of the things, the American character. What were some of the values that we espouse as Americans? And one of them is volunteerism. And I can tell audiences, I had this significant volunteer experience right after I got out of college. For other people, it might have been the Peace Corps or something else that was similar. But because of this volunteer experience, not only did I gain life experience and, a deeper devotion to serve others, but I gained some concrete skills like learning Laotian, which have directly helped me in my career. And so, that's why I think volunteer experiences, internships, community outreach are so important in whatever form it might take for you. Because I really, truly believe that they build both the individual and the community, but also can give you sort of a ladder and a leg forward. Some of the lessons I've learned over the years. Have a life outside of your career. I look back at my time at BYU and I studied really hard, and sometimes I wish I had spent a little more time doing some other things. There's so many wonderful things to do here, and I'm not saying this to get you in trouble with your professors or any of that kind of thing, but take advantage of opportunities that present themselves to you. I'm in Salt Lake this week because I'm going to Roots Tech, which is a large family history and genealogy conference. I only got into family history and genealogy 3 or 4 years ago, but I have found it a wonderful outlet for kind of intellectual and research skills other than what I do at work. And I have learned a lot about the history of my immigrant ancestors and what, say, socioeconomic or political conditions existed in the world that they were living in that forced them to come to the United States or led them to that choice. And that has been really interesting for me as a person that's interested in social sciences and international relations. So I took a week off work and flew to Salt Lake with my mom, and a couple of my other relatives were here, taking advantage of that opportunity. I have, throughout the years, there have been other things that I've enjoyed doing. The countries that I've lived in have allowed me to collect some art and some rugs, which I've enjoyed very much, and allowed me to travel quite a bit outside of work. But that is something I really espouse, because work is important, and work is hard, and work consumes a lot of your time, but you need to be able to find a way to be a well-rounded person. I have found that living overseas shall we say, teaches you a lot about what's important. You know, as members of the church, we espouse the value of religious freedom. And frankly, I have lived most of my career, with the exception of Belgium, in countries that restrict religious freedom. China, Turkey, Pakistan, all have, you know, restrictions on religious freedom. So does Laos, for that matter. And have seen what it's like for people of my faith and of other faiths to have to operate in that environment in terms of being able to live a life that they believe. I had the good fortune a couple of weeks ago to speak on a panel in Brussels. It was actually organized by the church, but I spoke in my official capacity representing the U.S. government about the U.S. government's position on religious freedom and the value that we place on it. And that has been something that has really been brought home to me. I have also realized as a member of the church, frankly, that most of the wards that you will attend outside of the United States don't look anything like the wards that you will attend inside the United States. And I think that's a wonderful thing. The ward I am attending right now is very diverse. Most of the people in the ward are not Belgian, or at least not Belgian by country of origin. And you see that this is a global institution, and that people live by the same principles no matter where you go. In Pakistan, I had the good fortune to have church in my living room, which was great, I will admit. But I'm now in a ward, and now this is the first time I've actually served in a ward since I've joined the Foreign Service, other than when I've been in DC. I would be happy to tell you some war stories and things like that. I've had some wonderful experiences in my career. I was, for about a year, I was what they call a senior watch officer at the department in Washington. The Operations Center in Washington is our crisis center. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and is constantly monitoring the world events and also keeping the secretary updated and supporting his or her communications. And I happened to be there one night, very late, 1 o'clock, 1:30, when we got news that there had been an earthquake in Fukushima, Japan. And having the responsibility of having to wake up everyone from the secretary to the person heading the Japan desk to all the embassies and consulates in the perimeter of what could have been a disastrous tsunami like we had in 2004, was a great experience in that you learn that the United States government has resources and has the desire to protect and help its citizens overseas. I've had the opportunity to meet both President Bush and President Obama, which was a great honor. And when I was working for Secretary Powell and Secretary Rice, doing travel staff for them. And seeing these people up close, learning how senior leaders make decisions, learning what factors they take into account and how they schedule their time is a wonderful learning opportunity at any level. And I recognize that. One thing, I had the opportunity at one point to get to know General Ray Odierno, and Ray Odierno just retired from the Army as the Army Chief of Staff, but before that he was the head of the multinational force in Iraq. and did a couple of other things. And while I was working for Condoleezza Rice, I did have the opportunity to sort of intersect with him a couple of times. And he gave a piece of advice that's really stuck with me, and that is take the hard jobs. Take the hard jobs. And I went to Pakistan in 2015, 2015, and I only planned to stay a year. And I had an onward assignment lined up in Rome, and my ambassador came to me and said, I'd like you to stay another year. Another year in Pakistan. And I thought about it for a long time, and I finally said, yes, I should do it because I need to take the hard job. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. I was the head of a public affairs section. We had a lot of resources to be able to send young people like your age to study abroad experiences in the United States, exchange programs, and change their lives, quite frankly, to provide them an opportunity they would not have had otherwise, and to also provide them with a link and a tie and an interest in the United States that will stick with them for the rest of their life. And that is the kind of relationships we are building. The current Prime Minister of Pakistan is actually an alumni of one of the US government exchange programs. It's the first time we've ever had that. But who would have known 20 years ago when he was sent on an exchange program that that's what would happen? But that's the kind of investment we are trying to make in these countries. So with that, I think I'll stop. And it is 5:02, and we have until 5:20. So I'm going to actually walk away from the mic and take your questions. Please.
So what's been your greatest obstacle in the State Department, and how have you overcome it?
The greatest obstacle. Oh, goodness. Okay. I don't know. I love my career. I don't think of much as an obstacle. I think one of the obstacles is we do move quite frequently. Even 2 years in Pakistan sometimes didn't feel like enough to understand the culture, to know the country, to understand how we could best influence our audiences and change things for good. I've been in Brussels for 6 months now, and I still just feel like I'm barely starting to understand the European Union. And this is a person who studied like European affairs in college and has been watching us for a long time. And so the way to overcome that, frankly, is just to dive in and get involved. It's easy sometimes to just want to stay home instead of going to this, an event or a lecture or something that will increase your understanding, or spending time with people who will help you know the country better. But it's so necessary. It's so incredibly necessary. And that, as diplomats, that's our job, is to relate with other people and governments on behalf of our country. And if we don't understand them, and we don't help them to understand us, then how do we do that? There's a question in the back.
Yeah, was it difficult to switch combs from econ to public affairs?
Yes, good question. Was it difficult to switch combs? It took me 2 tries. Every year there is a call for what we affectionately call in the State Department conal rectification, which sounds like a medical procedure, I know. So you have to, 2 things have to be true. You have to have served a certain amount of time in the cone that you want to switch to. And I had been able to do that, but that means you have to get an assignment in the cone you want to switch to. And sometimes that's the hardest thing of the entire thing. So that might mean you would need to take a job that's maybe less desirable or in a difficult place because you want to be able to get that experience. So you have to be able to get that job and serve that amount of time, and you also have to demonstrate success in it. I actually, after I switched, I sat on a board that reviewed applications of people who were switching. And you have to be able to demonstrate that you can compete for promotion to the next level against people who are already in the cone. So it does require hard work, but it's not impossible. I'd say the hardest part is just getting that assignment in the cone that you want. Not impossible, though. Next question. Please. Hi.
If you could change something that you did as an undergrad to
Yes.
better prepare you for your career now, what would it have been?
I would have studied French harder. really, truly, I would have studied foreign languages harder. I have French, but I have, like, my French is just barely sort of good enough. And I really wish it had been a lot better for you know, the opportunities I would have in the State Department and just be able to communicate with people on a daily basis. I just got called to be Relief Society president in my ward in Brussels. It's in French. So, like, being able to, you know, I really wish I could communicate a little bit better. But, you know, in terms of my things I wish I had learned more about, you can never study too much history. Really just understanding, you know, what's happened in the world, why it's happened, how it's affected people that you might interact with and work with. You just can't get enough of that. And I still feel like I'm learning that. Please.
During your time abroad, living in different countries and wherever you were residing, did you bring anything from home, any specific like American paraphernalia that you just felt like you needed to have that you missed?
Yeah, so I've always had my cat. I've had two cats. They've both been, well, one of them wasn't American, but the current incumbent was American. And I've always, let's see, if I brought anything else, but I have photos of my family. My father's passed away. I have photos that my father took. That's been very important for me to have. And in terms of, you know, specific American pieces of paraphernalia or culture, I think I bring more of my experiences than anything else. As I was graduating, or excuse me, as I was joining the Foreign Service, I took a trip to Memphis. Has anybody who's been to Memphis before? Well, Memphis is amazing, and as far as American history, it's amazing. It's the place where Martin Luther King was assassinated. It's the place that Elvis was from, and it's the place that, you know, some great American music is also from, besides, in addition to Elvis. And I just had that opportunity to take that with me because I felt like it would make me a better representative of the United States because I know a little bit more about my own people and culture. So, there's a question back here.
Yes, why did you decide to go and take a master's program twice?
Why did I take two master's programs? Yes, and sometimes I think, why did I take two master's programs? So the first time was because I felt like I needed additional expertise in my field. So I had been in the workforce, including my mission, 5 years, okay. So I felt at that point that the job market was such that I would either get another job that was very similar to the job that I had, or I needed to get some more expertise. And so I decided to go to graduate school. The second time I went to graduate school, I was actually in the Foreign Service. And so one of the career opportunities that the Foreign Service provides when you are what they call an O1, which is on the cusp of becoming a member of the Senior Foreign Service, is they provide opportunities for higher education, many of which are at the military universities that the U.S. military runs. And one of those is the National War College at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. And so that's what I did. The State Department gave me a year of paid salary to be a student full-time, and it was hard. I have a lot of empathy for you right now because I've forgotten how hard it is to be a student. But we spent, you know, 5 days a week, every week, studying the strategy and policy and history of American involvement in the world, and it was great. And I'll tell you how I even use it right now. So I had one class where we took, who's familiar with the National Security Strategy as a document? Okay. So every president puts out a national security strategy, and this has been happening since at least Reagan, and I can't remember if it's been before that. So we actually, one of our tasks as part of this class was to take the national security strategies from the various presidents and compare them and look and see how different administrations, you know, place different emphases on America's, you know, either political role in the world, military role in the world, our reliance on international organizations to get our jobs, you know, get what we wanted done. And So, I had that experience, and so in December, when President Trump put out his national security strategy, it was actually very natural for me to be able to read the document and say, okay, this president has a less of an emphasis on international and multilateral organizations and more of an emphasis on the realist perspective and the primacy of the nation state. And, what does that mean for the work that I'm doing, and how do I take what the president says he wants to accomplish in Europe and apply that to what I do in my job? So that was a really good experience for me, and I got to know a lot about the U.S. Armed Services. I was very impressed by the caliber of officers that they sent to that program. But it was seen as a leadership and professional development experience for near-to-be senior foreign service officers. Yes?
You kind of actually started talking about it. My question was, how does it change in administration? I think you've worked under 3 administrations so far.
It started with Clinton, so, yeah.
How does the change in administration actually affect your day-to-day work?
Sure.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. I think that's a fair question. So if you look at the national security strategy, and that's how I will refer to it. First of all, okay, the president has made several decisions that directly do affect our interactions with Europe. The decision to suspend our participation in the Paris Climate Agreement, to not pursue for the time being the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. It's suspended, it's not dead like TTP, but it's currently in sort of limbo probably until Brexit gets decided, frankly, because that's going to decide a lot of what the direction goes. And so, so those are 2 specific policy changes that affect our relationships with Europe and how we interact with them. But like I said, there's also a change in emphasis. President Obama was focused on opening markets for American companies in Europe. President Trump is focused on getting Europeans to invest in the United States. So that's a change in emphasis in economic policy. There is a increased, I would say not new, but increased push for us to encourage the European allies to pay a higher percentage of their GDP for their defense budgets and greater contributions to NATO. And that is, like I said, that's not new. But it is definitely an increase in emphasis and the amount that we advocate for that. There continues to be an emphasis on empowering women in terms of employment opportunities and entrepreneurship and innovation. That hasn't changed. The administration this year hosted the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Hyderabad, India. 2 years ago, it was hosted by the Obama administration in Silicon Valley. So, like I said, we do, so people have described U.S. foreign policy as like an aircraft carrier, and you don't just, turn it, but it has, the emphasis has changed. I think some of the core things have not changed, but the emphasis on certain things has changed. And again, that's why, a sophisticated reading of some of these policy documents is important. And while you have the time to do it, as students, I recommend that. So, please.
You touched a little bit on the Consular Fellows program. What would you say people looking towards that, or like what is your feelings towards it, or how do you see that?
Could you repeat the information?
You mentioned a little bit about the Consular Fellows program.
Oh, the consular.
Fellows program.
Okay, Consular Fellows is a little different than Consular Officers, yes. Consular Fellows is something that is relatively recent, and it is a limited term appointment. And if I am not mistaken, I'd have to double check, but I don't think there's a conversion opportunity. Yeah, so that's the difference. And so if you think you really just want to do this for 5 years, and that's all, and then you've got other plans, then maybe it is the right thing to do. And you will do consular work for the duration of that time, probably in one of the busiest places that we have. Brazil, Mexico, I don't know if the Philippines uses consular associates or consular fellows. But it is it's a good way to have a limited term opportunity, and certainly really important work. What else?
What's the percentage between men and women that work in the State Department? What opportunities are for?
Yes, for women. I'm glad you asked that question. More than there used to be. I'm trying to remember the exact number, but the percentage is closer to 50-50 than when I joined. When I joined in 1988, a third of my class was women out of 50, so what's that, 17 or so, were women, and now those are much closer to gender balance. Where a bigger focus of emphasis in the State Department has been not necessarily the recruitment of women, but the advancement of women. Women are still underrepresented as ambassadors. Women are still underrepresented as senior foreign service officers. And that will, over time, change as there's more women, of course. But the State Department has a couple of ways that it's trying to align those, the numbers so they should be where they should be. And frankly, I have not felt, as a woman in the department, I have not felt discriminated against. That may not be the experience of all of my colleagues, but I will tell you that I am quite the opposite. I have found it a very empowering career because I am an equal with my male colleagues on what we call the country team, which is the section chiefs of the embassy who meet with the ambassador on a regular basis. And the ambassadors I have had, some have been men, some have been women, treat my opinion the same way that they treat everybody else's. And so I've been very fortunate in that regard. And I've had some very good female role models. I have a small handful of friends who have achieved the status of ambassador, who are female, and I rely on them for advice and for mentoring and for things as, like reading my evaluations or helping me know where to bid next or what's the best opportunity. And having a good mentor / role model, friend, somebody who, when you have to make those decisions about what to do next, or, like in my case, whether to stay in Pakistan another year, I had a couple of people I could call and say, what do you think? And they gave me, unvarnished advice, and I trusted them. The year that I went to the National War College, the alternative was going to the National Security Council. And I had a really great female supervisor who helped me talk through that decision. And I'm glad I went to the National War College. I'm sad I didn't work on the NSC, but that was the trade-off I made. But finding those people who can be your trusted advisors of either gender, who can give you the kind of advice that you need throughout your career is indispensable. And I've been lucky that I've been able to find some women who have been really good role models for me.
What is the process in becoming an ambassador?
Oh, good question. There are two tracks for becoming an ambassador. There's the political track and the career track. Let me start with the career track. So for the career track, you have to be in the senior foreign service. Let's start there. And you have to have been either a deputy chief of mission, meaning a deputy ambassador, a consul general at one of our posts, like the head of a consulate, say, for example, our consulate in Istanbul or our consulate in Shanghai or, someplace like that, or a deputy assistant secretary in a department, which means that you were sort of the senior working level person for a particular portfolio. Once that happens, you've got to be, there is a selection process. You have to put yourself forward for it. You have to be selected. You have to be nominated to the White House. The White House has to take your nomination, and then the president nominates you. There's a lot of background checks and investigations that go along with that. I had a friend who was in that process, and she had worked in Eastern Europe most of her career and the Balkans, and she thought she was going to be ambassador to Slovenia, and her papers went over to the White House, and so she had a mentor figure in the White House, somebody who was helping her through the process, who called her and said, I'm really sorry, Slovenia is going to a political appointee. How do you feel about Cameroon? And she went to Cameroon as ambassador, knowing that it would probably be the only time in her life she would have that For the political appointees, much of it is based on the relationship the person has with the president or other senior White House officials. Often campaign contributions come into that. But the president tries to make the decision of who he thinks would be the best representative for him in a particular country. And there are some countries that traditionally get political appointee ambassadors, either because they're seen as very plumb, or because they frankly, the relationship demands that the person have a good relationship with the president. Tokyo, for example, I mean, the last ambassador was Caroline Kennedy, who brought with her the status of her family as well as her relationship with President Obama, which is very important to the Japanese. That process is a little bit different in that regard, but all the security and vetting and background checks and financial vetting and all of that is the same for either track. I think we're almost out of time. Let me just, can I leave you with one thing if there are no more questions? So this morning, who's familiar with Humans of New York? Yes, okay. So I heard Brandon Stanton speak this morning at Rootstech. He was one of the featured speakers this morning, and he gave some really great, he told the story of how he got involved with Humans of New York, and he got fired from his job in Chicago and started taking pictures and all this. But he said a couple of the lessons that he learned, and I just want to leave these with you because I thought they were really valuable. If you want to make a change in your life, don't wait for the perfect idea to come along. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, so to speak. Your life will be made up of hundreds of small evolutions. Following your dreams correctly is nothing but hard work. Pursue what you love full time. Trust that the ideas will come and you will become what you need to be. And I feel like in a lot of ways that's been my experience with the Foreign Service. I joined it with very idealistic, very excited. It's been a lot of hard work. A lot of opportunities have come up that I did not expect. But I feel like I've become what I need to become. I've had this wonderful opportunity to serve my country. And it's worked out. And I have BYU to thank for a lot of that. But I think your own hard work can get you